One of the many problems for Republicans in rejecting or outright mocking efforts to combat climate change with the Green New Deal is the fact that people quite like the Green New Deal, at least right now. The New York Times points to a recent survey showing strong support for the Green New Deal in 3 states where Republican senators are up for re-election in 2020. In Colorado, Cory Gardner state, 60% of likely voters supported the Green New Deal. In North Carolina, Tom Tillis' state, 56% did. And in Maine, where Susan Collins is likely to face a pretty tough re-election battle, 57% of likely voters supported the Green New Deal. And climate change isn't the only issue where Republicans are increasingly having a hard time coming up with any affirmative policy of their own. I want to bring in 2 veteran reporters on Republicans' conservative movement and their policies. Jane Coatston, who covers conservatism in the GOP as a senior politics reporter for Vox, and McKay Coppins, who's on the same beat as a staff writer for The Atlantic. Jane, I'll start with you. I think the Green New Deal attacks have been interesting because there's a lot of ridicule, but there's very little desire to actually, substantively engage.
Right. When you have Senator Mike Lee making the point that what needs to happen is more people need to have children in order to combat climate change, I think that that's a particular challenge. But I think it does go back to the basic issue that the Republicans are having right now, which is that they are acting as if they are not in power while in fact being in power. And so obviously, Republicans don't have control of the House, but they do have control of the White House. And I think it's interesting that the Green New Deal has being rejected, but there isn't a effort by either in the Senate or in the House to say, OK, here's what we would propose doing. We're seeing more and more Republicans agreeing that climate change is an issue and that humans have been impacting climate change, but there's no real effort to come up with a policy solution, because I think that for a lot of Republicans in Congress, the idea of finding a policy solution at the government level is anathema.
I think that what you just said there, Jane, I think is a really smart point, that they're acting like the opposition party as opposed to the party in control. And McKay, I remember Newt Gingrich and the Contract with America. I remember Tommy Thompson's governorship in Wisconsin, even the Reagan administration. It was like, we've got all these ideas. We're going to cut back the welfare state. We're going to change the way government works. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. What does the Republican Party want to do? It's just completely unclear what the actual affirmative agenda is.
It's strange. I read a news story today, and I'm not going to name the publication of the reporters because it's not necessarily their fault that there's so much ambiguity here, but it was about how President Trump had met with Senate Republicans at a private lunch today to discuss a sweeping, ambitious new legislative agenda. And it took until the 5th or 6th paragraph before it actually got at any of the actual policy items on the agenda. And it basically amounted to a couple of trade deals, get a couple nominees confirmed, and then a fairly far-fetched proposal to create a new Republican health care plan to replace Obamacare with, which I think they've already been down this road and it didn't go so well. I mean, it is actually quite strange how few new ideas we see coming out of the Republican Party at a time when they're actually positioned to implement them.
And Jane, I would say at a time when, for the 3rd year in a row, 2015, 2016, 2017, U.S. life expectancy declined for the first time since the flu pandemic in World War I. It's been 100 years. Something's going on in the country, and you can imagine a Republican Party that felt a fidelity to the, quote, so-called Trump base coming up with some ideas for something to do about that. And yet there just doesn't seem to be much.
Right. And you're starting to hear kind of ideas percolating, especially along with members of Congress who are interested in conservative populism specifically. Yeah. You're starting to hear representatives talking about expanding earned income tax credits and just kind of taking on this idea of OK, government should be involved in some means. But then again, you also they have to reckon with House Freedom Caucus. They have to reckon with the conservative members of their own party for whom the problem here is government intervention in the first place. And so I think that there's a sense that, a real difference of opinion in what is the government supposed to be doing. We are in charge of the government. What are we supposed to be doing? And they're not really getting much leadership from the White House when the White House is saying we're going to become the party of health care, when that's clearly not been the case over the last couple of years.
And one of the things, McKay, is that the White House actually never called the shots on the 2 big domestic policy priorities, which was health care repeal and the tax cut. Those were both things that President Marco Rubio would have pursued probably in that order. That was Paul Ryan and McConnell and the establishment. And sort of now that that's done, you can feel this kind of nihilistic listlessness, aside from confirming nominees in the Senate, emanating from congressional Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, something Jane said is true, which is that from the very beginning, the Republican control of government has really been more like a coalitional government that you would see in British Parliament, where you had various factions with distinct ideologies that were working together, sort of, especially on the tax cut, like you mentioned. But other than that, they just frankly disagreed on a lot of issues. The one issue, the one area where the Trump administration has been quite successful is in appointing federal judges. And they've been moving at a rapid pace compared to past presidents. And this is in keeping with a Republican strategy that the party has been pursuing for decades, which is they realized, frankly, earlier than a lot of Democrats and liberals, that shaping the judiciary was a way to implement their agenda on social issues, regulatory issues, economic issues. And that's where I think that you see a lot of the movement. But even that is not really coming from President Trump. It's being led by Mitch McConnell in a very kind of ambitious, aggressive way of confirming these nominees.
Yeah, I'm reminded there's a Grover Norquist line, I think it was back in 2012, when he was trying to rally the faithful around Mitt Romney, and the faithful were not particularly excited about Mitt Romney, that said all we need is someone with a hand to sign stuff, right? And it's sort of like that with the judges at this point. Jane Coaston and McKay Coppins, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.